There also is the additional difficulty in classifying his work stylistically, as history often seems to favor artists who are innovative, but those whose work also conforms to labels, which Davis and his art did not. Davis also painted most every day, and he was extremely prolific. And this is something that can be kind of a double-edged sword in terms of an artist's reputation, as the rarity factor can make an artist's work seem more precious and sought after. The reasons, in addition to the convention and subtlety of his work, there's also his limited subject matter, and the change in his late style probably contributed to the decline of his posthumous reputation. Davis, now often identified as an Impressionist, and for his cloud paintings, for works such as you see here in August, but he initially looked to the French Barbizon landscape tradition, and his work evolved from a tonalist aesthetic, as seen in this exceptional example from 1887. He transitioned through several distinct styles over the course of several decades, which I'll outline. And I hope that the variation and range of his work, which you can hopefully see here and in the exhibition, will kind of show, even though it was all landscape painting, how much variety there was within that. His compositions are exceptional for their stunning technical skill, subtle poetic quality, and really for their pure beauty. That he's not more widely recognized raises those perplexing questions about what is indicative of an artist's enduring reputation. And with regard to Davis, I hope that this invites a closer look at his art and the trajectory of his career from a contemporary vantage point. Looking to what propelled Davis toward a career in art, it was a boyhood visit to the Boston Athenaeum in 1874, where he saw an exhibition of the Duke of Montpensier's collection, which he later termed a second-rate lot of old masters. But there was also a gallery of Barbizon paintings on view that included work by the French artist Jean-François Millet. He was at first curiously repelled by Millet's realism and mundane subject matter, but he eventually became drawn to it. And interestingly, by his own admission, Millet remained an unshakable influence on him throughout the rest of his life. This experience was for him an artistic awakening and a revelation, as he said. For are we not converted and born again in ways mental as well as spiritual, as a light flashed suddenly into a hitherto darkened soul? Davis became determined to pursue a career in art, and in 1877, he embarked on a course of study at the newly formed School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where he remained for several years. By means of a generous benefactor from his hometown of Amesbury, he was able to continue his education abroad and left for Paris in the fall of 1880. There he enrolled at the Académie Julienne, a place where many American artists studied. And he worked there under well-known art instructors Gustave Boulanger and Jules-Joseph Lefebvre. Here you see a painting depicting a class given by another noted instructor, Bouguereau, from 10 years later, but it shows the instructional setting and the focus on the figure that study there entailed. From Davis's first trip to Barbizon in January 1881, he became convinced he would pursue a career in landscape painting. And because of that, he soon left the academy, feeling that their emphasis on figure study was for him going to be a useless exercise. Here, however, in a work from the following year, A Quiet Corner, you see a rare composition, which includes a figure, which is really truly a rarity in Davis's oeuvre. It's a transitional work, and it shows him finding his artistic voice, and it's actually the earliest example of his work in the exhibition. From time to time, Davis would include a small figure or cows in the distance of his landscapes, but not unusually of any significant scale, as you see here. He lived in Barbizon during this time and several other towns, and he eventually settled in the town of Fleury, which he professed was a place to which he had lost his heart and where he could focus on landscape painting. There he worked from nature, and he sought to formulate his own artistic direction while honing his technical skills. And I think it's really worth noting that despite Davis's exceptional aptitude for landscape painting, he never actually had any formal training in landscape painting at all. In the compositions he produced in France during the 1880s, he remained under the sway of Millet and the Barbizon landscape tradition. In his choice of subjects during these years in France, an homage to Millet is certainly evident. He did a number of these haystack and gleaning scenes, picturing the rural agricultural peasant life, and these were things that he took from Millet. And he also began focusing his artistic attention on these delicate atmospheric effects and the play of light upon the landscape. And here you see two French scenes from this period that exemplify the interests. A compositional key element to Davis's art crystallized around this time, that of the horizon line. This was something he experimented with, and a number of his French pictures have this unusual high horizon line. And here at the bottom, I'm also showing you a scene of Millet, not to suggest that Davis knew this particular work, but just to show the general similarities that you see and the influence he had on him. Davis began exhibiting in the Paris Salon in 1881, and he continued fairly consistently exhibiting through the 1880s there. While living abroad, he was also well represented in exhibitions back home, sending paintings here, entering them in annuals at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Boston Athenaeum, and the Pennsylvania Academy. And he also began showing in the Boston Gallery Dahl and Richards. The success of his first exhibition in America, held in Boston in 1883, realized enough money allowing Davis to remain abroad for some years. He received early international recognition in the late 1880s with an honorable mention from the Paris Salon of 1887 for Last Rays, which you see on top there. The Brook Effect at Evening was exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1890, and a review of it called it very true and profoundly singular. And it was also shown in Chicago and then in the 1891 exhibition at the Pennsylvania Academy. And the Academy actually purchased it from the show, making it the earliest institutional acquisition for Davis. Last Rays was shown at the 1901 Chicago Annual and the 1902 Pennsylvania Academy Annual, by which time it was acquired by the Union League Club. And we're especially pleased that this work was able to be included in the exhibition here. So these works really illustrate these subtly modulated tonal effects that are blended with this nearly invisible brushwork, and I think it really shows off the keen mastery of realism that Davis achieved by this early point. Most obvious as well is a notable characteristic of all his early work. There's a real quiescent stillness that characterizes these scenes, and it's something that it really essentially remains a presence throughout all of his work. And here you can see a bit of the lowering of the horizon line, again, the key element in Davis's work. So it's works such as these that were done abroad that really launched Davis's career. He also received honors back home that continued with a succession of illustrious awards and honors that continued throughout the years up until 1921. So that's really a 30-year span where he consistently won awards. That's really something quite unusual. He was nominated an Associate of the National Academy in 1901, and he became a full academician in 1906. And his diploma painting is included in the exhibition of Springtime. As early as 1902, William Howe Downs, a critic, declared that Davis had staying power and was one of the most eminent of living American landscape painters. And others weighed in with similar assessments throughout the next several decades. While in France, Davis married and started a family, but he soon realized that he wished to return to America. 1891 marks a turning point for him and his return to the States. He had set his sights on living in the Nutmeg State, and he traveled south by train from Boston toward New Haven, looking for a place to settle. And he wanted a water setting, and eventually came upon Mystic, with its coastal feel, hills, stone walls, and rocky topography. And he found a house there that was called Long Bar, that sits on a spit of land and is largely surrounded by water, which he purchased in 1891, and he lived in for the remainder of his life. Here you see period and a contemporary view of the house. The contemporary one is on top. And you can see the house looks little changed in the years, except for the garden that Davis had. He was an avid gardener. And here you see he and his wife, Frances, working in the garden. Davis was considered the first true artist to settle in Mystic, and he became known as the Dean of Mystic Painters. As other artists were drawn there to relocate, it became an art colony revolving around Davis and the Mystic Art Association, which he helped found in 1913, which is now the Mystic Art Center. The Mystic Art Colony is admittedly less well-known and established than those of Cos Cob and Old Lyme, but the Mystic Art Association became a really active hub of an art community there. It held increasingly ambitious annual exhibitions as the artistic ranks grew. Among the better-known artists who were drawn to the area were Henry Ward Ranger, Colin Campbell Cooper, and later Robert Brackman, an instructor at the Art Students League and also at the Mystic Art Association. And here you see on the right a wonderful portrait by him of Davis, probably done in the 1920s. Picturesque Mystic and the pastoral scenery came to represent for Davis what the French Barbizon region had been for him, the primary subject for his art and a boundless source of inspiration. He had a rather retiring temperament, which I think you could sort of see from the photographs of him. But he purposely absented himself from the limelight. He worked quietly and independently, pursuing his own artistic objectives from the bucolic Connecticut countryside. In Mystic, he explored similar themes as he had in France, as in Grey Day, which harks back to the Barbizon-style landscapes, and as well as the works done in Massachusetts just after he arrived back in America, such as you see here in Frosty Morning. And these really explore this delicate atmosphere and the play of light on the landscape. So he continues working along these same lines. Once back in America, his compositions have an intimacy and a serenity, and they really reveal his genius for capturing atmosphere. Many have an almost otherworldly sensibility, and again, devoid of figures. Another outgrowth of Davis's near religious reverence for nature was for him the necessity of working directly from the subject. So he worked from nature, took his easel outside and worked directly from the subject. And he asserted that this way of working was the only way there was to paint as honestly and faithfully like nature as possible. The appearances appearance of Davis's work began to change by around the turn of the century. He assumed new subjects and motifs in his work, more relaxed brushwork, and there's a sunnier overall feeling and directness in approach. A key element on which he began to focus was this expansive sky with luminous cloud effects, often overlooking the bucolic hills, sometimes populated with small trees and cows, and a distant low horizon line. These three early works are examples of this type. And this subject was to have real artistic resonance for him. In particular, the work you see here on the top left, Summer Clouds, was one of his most monumental, and it was also one of his most widely exhibited. It was shown in 1900 at the Carnegie International, the 1901 Pennsylvania Academy Annual, and there it won the Lippincott Prize. It was also shown in Buffalo in 1901 and the 1902 National Academy and Chicago Annuals. And it shows the clouds as a very distinctive type, cumulus, and this was the type that he most favored. And you can also see, particularly in that work, how he really has played with the light reflecting on the landscape. And this was a detail he really focused on. And I do want to call your attention to that work. I was unable to find it. It had been in the Gaylord Hospital for many years, and then it was sold. And it's really one of his largest works. And because it was so important, I tried to find it, but to no avail, unfortunately. By 1906, Davis had largely left behind that reserved tonal style of his early work, with that deliberate and polished handling. With his first major New York solo exhibition in 1906 with the noted Macbeth Gallery, his subjects were directed towards richly verdant scenery with blue skies and scattered cottony clouds. So richly rendered and meteorologically accurate were his interpretations of the sky and clouds that they actually became known as Davis skies. Clouds then began to assume this real important emphasis in his work. And in 1909, he even authored a detailed article on clouds in which he explained the principles of their representation in great detail, how they looked, how they should be rendered at various times and conditions, and how this affected their appearance. He underscored the importance of understanding clouds within a landscape composition, and he even declared, "If you do not love skies sufficiently to observe and study them as you would the figure or other elements of a landscape, put up your horizon line or otherwise eliminate the sky, for you cannot fill large spaces with interest without earnest, loving study in this direction, any more than in any other." So by 1910, Davis had arrived at the paradigm of his cloud subjects, typified by these two notable examples. August, a monumental composition, was likely completed in the summer of 1908 for an upcoming 1909 solo exhibition at Macbeth Gallery. In reviews of the exhibition, the painting was praised, heralding the type of composition that really began to earn Davis recognition. The review said, "A few years ago, we would hardly have expected him to develop into the painter of such landscapes as August, with these strong cloud forms scudding across the sky and casting luminous shadows on the rolling country of real earth and rock." The painting was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum in 1909, a gift of the noted benefactor George A. Hearn. So landscape compositions of this type would have real lasting resonance for Davis, and they also really came to define his artistic identity, attracting the attention of juries, critics, avid collectors, and museums. In April, which you see on the right, is also a wonderful example, and this is this shows this really pearlescent quality of the sky that he was able to uniquely achieve. This painting was exhibited in 1910 at the Carnegie International, the Pennsylvania and Chicago annuals, and it was acquired by the Muskegon Museum actually as early as 1911. So works such as these found their way into quite a number of museum collections, many by purchase, as it really became important to have a representation of Davis's work. And he continued in his own work to explore and riff on this essential compositional type throughout the remainder of his life. In the following years, his paintings began to be more suggestive and subjective, and to have a brighter and lighter palette. And he also began to explore the idea of wind in terms of movement within the composition. And the idea of wind is often included in the title, such as you see in these two works. And these are two of his actually most important paintings. Davis's brushwork around this time begins to slacken, yet he's still able to capture a real pristine sense of clarity in the atmosphere, even sometimes achieving a dramatic effect, such as particularly the work on the left, Call of the West Wind, where he's got these dark trees profiled against the light sky or a brilliant sunset sky. This change in his approach was picked up on a couple of years earlier in reviews of his 1910 solo exhibition, in which a critic wrote, "He has changed his subjects and his treatment, and now presents, in place of his old-time marshes and lowlands at quiet eventines, vales upon high mountain ridges and expanses of country, and with clouds wind-blown across stormy or sunlit skies, and with a sense of rushing air." And this is something that is particularly evident in a group of later works, one of which you'll see in the exhibition, I hope, called Wind Driven, where you absolutely can feel the movement of the clouds and the wind. Works such as Call of the West Wind and the Northwest Wind reflect Davis's mastery of this differing subject matter. Call of the West Wind, shown in 1917 at the National Academy and the Art Institute of Chicago annuals, the National Academy gave Davis the prestigious Altman Prize for it that year. And in 1919, the Butler Institute acquired it. The painting was exhibited again in 1922 and 1934 at Macbeth Gallery, and it was so often reproduced, it really has become emblematic of Davis's work. It's probably the work that you see most often. Davis was seemingly everywhere, showing his work in as many exhibitions as he could. He had a very strong work ethic and was also very productive. And he usually maintained a ready supply of new work that he could show and enter in exhibitions. Surprisingly, because he was not an avant-garde artist, he exhibited in the 1913 Armory Show with a single work, which is unlocated. He also showed in the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in California, and he won a gold medal there for the painting Northwest Wind, which you just saw, and also May Morning, which you see here. Another work I was unfortunately unable to locate. By the late teens, Davis began to tire of his persistent identification with cloud subjects, and he also became interested in other subjects, particularly depicting seasonal scenes, summer and spring being the most frequent, as in works such as Spring in the Hills, which you see here. In this and a number of other works from the mid-teens, you can see this very sunny palette of color, pastel opalescent colors, and a sort of a vaporous atmosphere. At the same time as he introduces this new motif of wispy, leafless trees, and really focusing on the rolling terrain and jagged stone walls that are so typical of the New England countryside. And this is something that he directly took from the area around his home in Mystic. The photo of the stone wall that you see on the bottom is actually a stone wall that's on the edge of his property. And I just include that to mention that it's like a leitmotif in Davis's paintings from the teens. You begin to see it constantly. Another notable feature is that in his pictures of this period, approximately 1/3 of the upper canvas is often devoted to sky, and you can see him again varying the horizon line. So from the late teens on, Davis explores and employs more poetic license in his landscapes than in earlier efforts. His compositions now more often rely on his mind's eye and were studio productions rather than the result of direct observation. He did a large studio renovation in 1916, and I think these two aspects went hand in hand. As his style matured, he used nature as an artistic vehicle, colored by mood and filtered through a lens of spirituality, in a similar conceptual vein as that of the landscape painter George Inness, although with actually different results. Davis expanded his subject matter beyond the cloudscapes that had become the expectation of collectors, dealers, and critics. As his wife Frances recounted, he became the cloud painter, and Davis skies were demanded on all sides. The cloud pictures were sold as soon as exhibited, and the dealers were always asking for more. Then Charles cried halt and ceased to paint them except when the urge was so great that he could not resist. The dealers rebelled, friends remonstrated, almost everyone misunderstood, but he knew he was right, and no argument could move him. When he felt prompted to paint a subject which would not sell, he never let that fact keep him from it. In March 1921, Davis had another solo exhibition at Macbeth's dedicated to his Connecticut landscapes, which consisted mainly of seasonal themes, especially spring and summer, and included Blythe June and summer uplands, as well as spring on the hillside, which I'll show. This showing was again well received, as with Davis's other shows, and elicited good attendance, but sales ultimately proved disappointing. Although Davis is believed to have largely renounced the cloud themes that became his signature motif by the late teens or early 20s, yet he did nonetheless still continue to produce them, but with less frequency. He also experimented with the size, shape, and proportions of the canvas, which run from very large to small, as well as vertical and horizontal and rectangular shapes, and taking them from different perspectives with close-up views to distant views, as well as subject types. And this tree motif is also something that he began experimenting with. He continued to paint the seasonal themes throughout the 20s, and it became a greater emphasis in his work. And he also produced quite a number of snow scenes, which is something not generally associated with Davis. These developments certainly had some effect on the market for his work. Nonetheless, the Macbeth Gallery offered unconditional support for Davis's creative choices, as the director Robert McIntyre indicated to him in a letter. "You have had an eye more to the artistic value of what you have done than the case with which a prospective buyer can be separated from his cash. There is no doubt whatever that these are artistically among the finest things you have sent us, and I know that they will be well received by the artists. I wish I could feel just as strongly that they would make an instantaneous and equal appeal to the buyers. But it will not be our fault if we cannot make them see that the artistic quality is quite as much to be desired as the typical Davis." Spring on a Hillside, also exhibited in the 1921 Macbeth show, illustrates a secondary subject that Davis turned to in the teens, one that really highlights those rock walls and the hilly topography. May morning, which I previously showed, and is also marked by this pastel coloration and more impressionistic touch. Spring on the Hillside was shown again at Macbeth's 1922 anniversary show, as well as Davis's memorial exhibition, and it was acquired privately and later gifted to the Cleveland Museum in the 1930s. So this type of composition was not the type immediately associated with Davis, as his early subjects and cloud paintings were, but it became an important secondary subject for him. And again, I show a painting by Millet, again not to suggest that he was acquainted with this work, but again to illustrate that Millet was still a very powerful force over Davis, even into the 20s, because you can see very similar compositional type here. Macbeth Gallery remained a consistently strong advocate for Davis's work, although the newer paintings prompted fewer sales among their clientele. Davis and McIntyre had voluminous correspondence about matters pertaining to the gallery, sales, exhibitions, and arrangements, and misunderstandings seemed to periodically arise. Davis seemed quite sensitive to perceived slights and was often in need of reassurance, which McIntyre often offered, such as this 1920 dispatch when he said to Davis, "There isn't a man we would rather push, with full knowledge that we are doing our public a real good by pushing you. We are always on the job where you are concerned." By the 20s, Davis had certainly arrived, boasting a lengthy list of museum collections, big and small, who had purchased his work, and they acquired Davis for their permanent collections because it was almost obligatory to have a representation of his work. In spite of waning sales, the artist's popularity reached a zenith in the 20s. A work, Sunny Hillside, again another work unlocated, it won the second Clark Prize in 1919 from the Corcoran Gallery, and also the Saltus Medal for Artistic Merit from the National Academy in 1921, which was actually his last major prize. But in 1922, a culminating event was that Davis was honored with a major solo exhibition in celebration of Macbeth Gallery's 30th anniversary. Robert McIntyre affirmed that the gallery could think of no better way to celebrate than by showing, as he said, the work of our old-time friend. We assembled a retrospective exhibition that was a joy to behold. Davis arguably had exhibited there more than just about any other artist. He had an astounding number of exhibitions, solo exhibitions, 8, in addition to his memorial show. And he also had a notable presence in virtually every other group show that they had, often with multiple submissions. Again, a sign of his prolific output. The 1922 anniversary exhibition was crowned by a smoker, generally an all-male gathering held in his honor, hosted by the gallery, and it had more than 150 artists, critics, and dealers in attendance, including Robert Henry McBride, George Bellows, Chauncey Ryder, Elliot Dangerfield, Haley Lever, critic Royal Cortizo, dealer Frank Wren, and many other distinguished art world contemporaries who you see listed here. You can see the retiring Davis seated to the center of where I should get the pointer, seated to the left of the man sitting on the floor. Again, typically not drawing attention to himself. That Davis was singled out as the honoree for this milestone celebration is clearly indicative of the lofty stature in the art world he had at that time. The exhibition and smoker received extensive press notices. Reviews of the show, which featured 31 canvases, garnered high praise. As one writer asserted, Charles Davis takes his place with the great creative painters of our time. The 1922 Macbeth show also demonstrated Davis's shifting emphasis in subject matter. Critics noticed his move away from cloud subjects, and though they still remained largely favorable. The general effect of the show is of great beauty and of marked variety, for the Davis of the cloud pictures of former years has changed of late into a Davis concerned with other qualities, ranging from the faint delicacies of springtime's first blooming to the rigors of winter's cold and snow. In the catalog text, Davis was cited as part of the American landscape tradition in the company of such eminent painters as John Henry Twachtman, George Inness, and Theodore Robinson, artists who are really central to the American art canon, although that's less the case with Davis now. The exhibition had works representing most aspects of Davis's production, though some critics interestingly referenced his most recent efforts as his most admired. Besides Passing Summer and The Old Pasture seen here, both of which are in the exhibition, May Morning, Spring on the Hillside, and Call of the West Wind, works that I've shown and also date to the teens, were among those in the exhibition. And again, his landscapes now were much less oriented toward realism, and they were seemingly invested with a deeper meaning, and it became mood and the spiritual aspect of landscape that he sought to express, rather than capturing realistic effects. And I think none really better exemplifies this than All Halloween. Sunsets were also something that captured Davis's imagination, especially with this dark profile of trees against the brilliant sky. And it was a subject that he returned to periodically. At this time, he continued working less and less outdoors. And it's especially in this sense, as well as with this regard to approach and style, that I really think the applied label of Impressionist for Davis is not at all an accurate one. The last stage of Davis's production, dating from the mid-20s, is marked by changes in his technique, with even more liberated brushwork, sometimes to the point of lashing strokes, fresh color, and only the occasional representation of cloud-filled skies. In 1925, Davis had yet another solo exhibition at Macbeth's, which was called The New England Year in Paintings, in which his latest works were widely introduced. As the name implies, Davis really had developed a particular regional association with New England, even though he actually really pictured the area in and around Mystic more often than anything else. His wife, Frances, recalled that he really seemed very pleased when he was described as the interpreter of New England. Although it had been some years since he had actually cut back on the acclaimed cloud studies, critical notices for this new show still complained about their decrease in production. Of the 15 paintings in the exhibition, which favored autumn and spring themes, only 2 were cloud subjects. Over the Uplands is an example of this type of laid cloud composition, and it shows his much more painterly approach with this still familiar subject. And you can see how far his style had evolved from this early, very tight, realist style. And they become much more unrestrained and lighter and brighter and much more fluid and interpretive. So these new works really departed to a degree from the critical expectation. One critic remarked, "Plainly the painter is in the thick of a transitional phase, but in spite of the perhaps cloudy and indeterminate handling to be found in some of these recent paintings, there is a gorgeous abundance of poetic postulation, a fine willingness to let facts be fused in fancy." Seasonal themes in Davis's mature years results in more and more winter and autumn scenes. he favored the same type of topography and subjects that he always had, the rolling hills, the winding roads, and the stone walls, although they're now rendered in a more exaggerated and stylized manner, such as you see here. Countryside in Autumn was shown at the 1928 Carnegie International and at the 1930 National Academy. Autumn, it turns out, was actually Davis's favorite season. He preferred the first turning of the leaves and declared November almost, if not quite, the loveliest month of the year. Particularly his late autumnal scenes show deeper, earthier tones, these dark outlines, and they're applied with a much more rough, unblended brushstroke, highlighting how far he had come from these early Barbizon-influenced paintings. His snow scenes, such as you see here, use that same broad stylistic interpretation, but he used a very narrow range of monochromatic hues with highlights of pink, blue, and purple. And so at this time, he's working in these various palettes, the pastels of spring, the richer fall tones, and the monochromatic winter scenes. Several years passed until Davis's next and last major exhibition in his lifetime, a solo exhibition in 1929 at Macbeth's. The selection included a range of seasonal themes, prompting one writer to proclaim, "He follows the seasons, he loves them all." The exhibition, which ran from November to December 1929, was well received as usual and prompted critics to really embrace the artist's late vision and even declare that he's now doing his best work. But the exhibition proved devastating in terms of timing, as it followed on the heels of the October stock market crash, which surprisingly resulted in a dearth of sale. The unstable market continued to affect art sales for years to come, and Davis's paintings found few buyers into the 1930s. It was a source of great consternation to him, the art world, and of course the country at large. While Davis never worked with an eye toward popular or commercial appeal, he was also less than reluctant to compromise on pricing, somewhat surprising. Robert McIntyre of Macbeth Galleries warned him of these new harsh realities and really emphasized the importance of lowering prices. As he said to Davis, "Everyone, as far as I know, is doing it. In fact, it's the only way to do business nowadays. Even at that, sales are few and far between." By June 1932, McIntyre confided to Davis that New York was certainly an awful place to be in these days. "I certainly have never seen anything like it in the picture business." The situation apparently even worsened, for in the spring of 1933, McIntyre related to Davis's wife, "I am afraid I can't hold out hope of sales regardless of price. If we thought things were bad a year or two ago, we've learned that they were comparatively good." Unfortunately, Davis never did witness a revival of his popularity or the economic recovery of the art world. He continued to paint sporadically nearly until the end. These two very late works attest to the long creative trajectory that Davis's art had undergone. Rocky Hillside and the even later work Boulders show this real slashing brushstroke and a really bold and delicate palette with a liberal use of black and interpretive rock and tree forms. And they reveal, at least to me, a far more expressive and intuitive approach and abandonment in his style that I found truly surprising. I mean, when you look at this work, it's hard to believe next to the early work, Last Rays, that they're actually from the same artist's hand. His last major work, Autumn in Connecticut, seen here, was completed some months before he succumbed to pneumonia in August 1933. Again, it's typical of this late, bold style. pure colors, unblended. There's a real angularity to it. And after the artist passed away, to commemorate him, Macbeth Gallery organized a major memorial show in his honor in the spring of 1934. Davis was heralded as a poet and a mystic and lauded for his contribution to the landscape tradition. The exhibition surveyed his career, showing through selected loans the development of his style. Critics saw Davis's late work as similarly exhibiting the suggested expression seen in the moderns and praised their singularity. One critic called him a progressive spirit, and similar sentiments were echoed in other reviews, such as the following. The lovely landscapes of Connecticut are still discernible in these paintings of his final period, but not objectively, instead only as they had become a part of him. Such pictures have rarely been attempted in America. Their achievement stands conspicuously apart, alone in our generation. Davis's reputation for solid technical mastery and his poetic interpretations are still evident even in his late work, such as the work you see here, The Farm, from his last active year of painting. And a work like this, it shows he wasn't just working in a single style. This somewhat harks back to his earlier efforts, but it's also marked by a freedom and fluidity. At the time of his passing in 1933, Davis was still regarded as one of the American masters of the landscape, but he was also one of the old guard, which makes it somewhat surprising that he was classed there even briefly with the moderns. He worked out of the mainstream and dedicated himself to this traditional theme of the pastoral landscape, admittedly a narrow focus. Yet this focus served him well for the better part of his professional life. His works, rarely dramatic or theatrical, instead convey a sense of tranquility, stillness, beauty, and lyricism. These qualities and the lack of a definite stylistic aesthetic have made it difficult to categorize his work, and I would argue this has been somewhat detrimental to his posthumous reputation, as perhaps also was his prolific output and limited range of subjects. While his early work clearly falls within the tonal aesthetic, he departed from that and evolved toward a more impressionistic style. Yet he was certainly not an impressionist. His paintings really sprung from his creative imagination, and he sought to convey his truly spiritual reverence for nature. He was certainly known also to be his own man and was not interested or part of any other formal movement. He also didn't delve deeply into progressive modernist ideologies, but he attempted really to push his art towards a more modern vein in his late career, while confronting a differing public expectation of what his art should be. And this was also compounded by an exceedingly difficult economic climate. His accomplishments really earned him a place of distinction in American landscape painters in his day, and hopefully that stature will eventually regain some of its former prestige. And we certainly hope this exhibition will help in that end. The artist's most devoted critic, Louis Bliss Gillett, aptly summarized what uniquely defined Davis as a painter, as he observed. What he catches to a unique degree is the intangible thing, the temper of the weather, the tune or mood of the season. In his masterpieces, it went even further than this, for Davis was a mystic at heart. It is in the spirit or mystery lying behind each scene or mood of nature that was the study of his thought. Thank you very much. And I gather there may be questions? Yes. one can never know that, but I would say the lack of a single aesthetic style, because he was many different things. He was tonal, he painted in impressionistic way. His late work may have was less well received because he was so associated with the cloud subjects. He was also very prolific. And then there's the whole advent of modernism, because although he dabbled in aspects of modern approaches, he was not a modernist. So those in essence would be some of the reasons. And there's the ebb and flow of what's in vogue, just as it is today, whether painting's in vogue or minimal art or conceptual art. And those same tides or similar comparable tides were in evidence at that time.